right, welcome back to Headline Geopolitics. I'm your host, José Niño, and this evening I'm joined by Dave DeCamp, the news editor at Antiwar.com and the host of Antiwar News with Dave DeCamp. How are you tonight, Dave?
I'm good. I'm doing good, Jose. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we touched base a bit at the Ron Paul Institute conference this past weekend, and there were some great speakers there. But before we start, let the audience know about yourself and the current work you do.
Yeah, so I am the news editor of Antiwar.com. So if you go to Antiwar.com, you see the top section is the news section, and we run a lot of original stories in there, which I mostly write. And we also have Jason Ditz and Kyle Anzalone also been helping me out in there as well. And, you know, we run stuff from around the internet, kind of a news aggregator as well. And essentially what I do is cover U.S. foreign policy kind of from a critical lens from our anti-war, non-interventionist perspective. And a lot of times that just kind of means cutting out the fluff, cutting out the propaganda that you'll see in a typical news story. Or sometimes inserting the proper context. Right now, a lot of my work's been focused on what's happening in Gaza because it's just so horrific and it's all being funded and supported by the U.S. But it's from a specifically, kind of American point of view where we focus on the wars and interventions of our government overseas, basically.
One thing that I recalled from one of our previous conversations was what got you really involved in analyzing foreign policy. And if I vaguely remember, you said something to the effect that like the Saudi Arabian bombing of a school bus in Yemen during the Saudi intervention in Yemen was like a turning point for you. Why was that moment so pivotal for you?
Yeah, at the time, so this was back in 2018, and I remember after the 2016 election, I was started to follow politics around then, and I remember Trump came in 2017, and this horrific war was happening in Yemen, and like you saw all kind of the criticism of him from his political opponents just had nothing to do with foreign policy and all the bombing campaigns he was involved in. At the time, because the Democrats and Obama, of course, were doing it too. So it's a very bipartisan thing. But I remember just following the war in Yemen, this was the U.S.-backed Saudi war, which involved the blockade, a starvation campaign, and bombing of civilian infrastructure. So it was around that time I started really following it. And it got no media coverage at the time, like in the mainstream, like at all. So I remember when they bombed that school bus, that did make the news cycle at least, but it faded out pretty quickly. And so I remember it was that moment, like I had this frustration and I needed to channel it somewhere, and it turned into writing and submitting articles to Antiwar.com, which led me to where I am today. And I've been working full time for them since 2020 now. So it's been a few years, but it was really kind of, and we still see this today. Like, I just wrote a story about Somalia. The U.S. has launched 58 airstrikes in Somalia this year. And how many people are aware of that? And when it came to Yemen, it was specifically like the humanitarian. It was just so brutal and for no good reason. So it was just that kind of, angered me, and I channeled it into writing.
The Yemeni conflict is definitely one of like the more overlooked battle zones that the U.S. is definitely involved in through its just provision and constant provision of military aid and intelligence to the Saudi-led coalition. And what's the status of that conflict now in 2025? Because it's taken some weird turns over the last few years.
Yeah. Basically, since 2022, there's been a ceasefire between the Houthis, who are the government in essentially what used to be North Yemen. Before 1990, North and South Yemen were different countries, and the Houthis are Ansar Allah, as they are known. They took power in 2014, and they've been in power ever since, and the Saudis tried to get rid of them from 2015 to 2022. And essentially, since 2022, there's been some skirmishes on the ground between the Houthis and Saudi-backed forces, and some shelling across the border. But there have been no Saudi airstrikes and no Houthi attacks, missile or drone attacks on Saudi Arabia. That was really what made the Saudis pursue peace with the Houthis, was the fact that they got really good at striking their oil fields with missiles and drones. So the turn that it took was after October 7th, the Houthis started imposing essentially a blockade on Israeli shipping and Israeli-linked shipping, and started attacking ships that were headed to Israel or that had some or were owned by Israelis or something like that. And then who came in to save the day and defend the Israeli ships? Of course, it was the U.S. So in January 2024, Joe Biden started bombing the Houthis directly, and it was the first time that the U.S. really did that. What's interesting is that the Saudis have wanted nothing to do with it. Obviously they provide some sort of support because the U.S. has bases in Saudi and everything, but they have not been, they've publicly distanced themselves from this war. So from January 2024 to January 2025, the U.S. and the U.K., mainly the U.S., were launching airstrikes against the Houthis, which did nothing. The thing about them is that they're very resilient, which the Saudi bombing campaign showed. They just became tougher during that time. So Biden failed, but then there was a ceasefire in Gaza, and the Houthis stopped their attacks. And then in March of this year, Israel violated the ceasefire deal by imposing a total blockade on Gaza. The Houthis said, we're going to reimpose our blockade on Israel. And then guess what happened? The U.S. started bombing them again. Operation Rough Rider, they called it. This was the Signal Gate scandal. This was the bombing campaign that they were talking about in those leaked signal messages. And Trump really unleashed the military, essentially let them do whatever they want. And they launched some really brutal strikes, like big massacres of civilians. There was one attack on a fuel port where they killed over 80 civilians, mostly port workers. The justification was, this is a fuel port that the Houthis profit off of. The U.S. military didn't even claim that they were hitting a military target. And then they followed that up. I mean, I shouldn't laugh, but it's just so absurd the way this bombing campaign went. A few days later, they bombed a migrant detention facility in northern Yemen, and they killed 60 African migrants who were prisoners there. And there must have been some, I don't know what their justification was for that strike. Maybe they claim there's some Houthi military infrastructure there, but the Saudis bombed the same place back in January 2022 and killed 100 migrants. And, the U.S. and the Saudis have the same intelligence and target bank. So I don't know what the excuse is for that. But anyway, so where things stand now, what happened was the Trump administration gave up on getting the Houthis to stop targeting Israel. And the Houthis kept firing missiles and drones at the U.S. warships that were bombing them, put them under significant pressure. They shot down 12 U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drones. The U.S. lost at least 2 fighter jets that fell off aircraft carriers when they were trying to avoid Houthi attacks. So it was a loss for the U.S., and they just agreed to a ceasefire. Basically, you don't attack our ships, we won't bomb you, which was an arrangement they could have had before they started bombing them. So they really gave up on getting them to stop targeting Israel, and they've continued to fire missiles and drones at Israel. They've attacked a few ships recently. And Israel's trying to get the U.S. to start bombing them again, but so far that hasn't happened. So essentially where we're at, Israel just launched some missile strikes on Yemen. They don't seem to be very effective, but the Houthis keep firing these missiles at Israel. And it's not like they do damage, but they kind of keep the pressure on, and they have really affected the shipping to Israel. So it's certainly a thorn in Israel's side, what they've been doing.
I'm not sure how aware you are of some of the developments in the Yemeni civil war, because it seems that there's been a splintering among the Saudi coalition between the Saudi wing and the Emirati wing, the United Arab Emirates. It seems that the Emirates are trying to create a separatist entity in Yemen that in some respects is actually aligning itself with Israel a lot more, in that island of Socotra or whatever. It's called. Do you know much about that? And has that panned out into like anything thus far?
Yeah, that island, Socotra, there's been reports and rumors that, because it's essentially controlled by the UAE, one of their proxies, there's been reports that Israel was establishing some kind of intelligence base there, but I haven't seen much follow-up on that or if that's really confirmed. But there was a split because the Saudis were trying to reinstall the government that the Houthis kicked out of
the
Sana'a.
Hadi.
Yeah, the Hadi government. And but they essentially gave up on that goal. And in 2022, when they agreed to a ceasefire, they formed what they call the Presidential Council. And it includes different factions in Yemen who are like the anti-Houthi factions, including the Southern Transitional Council, which is like the Southern separatists. So they were backed by the UAE, as you mentioned, and they split. They tried their own kind of independence and separatist route separate from what the Saudis were trying to do. But they've kind of merged those coalitions to form this presidential council. But the council's like based in Saudi, like it doesn't have any real power in Yemen. But this STC council does, and they've been they were trying to get some support from the U.S. for a new ground offensive against the Houthis, but that didn't pan out. And from what I understand, some of the other factions, because they're anti-Israel, have kind of rallied around, like the Houthis have gained more domestic support. And I mean, when their leader calls like a rally in Yemen, people show up. I mean, again, these are the areas that they
I've seen those images. They're massive.
It's huge. Wow. Yeah, it's crazy. Like the amount of hundreds of thousands, millions of people show up to these big rallies, and they all got rifles. So, I mean, they're not, and I've seen some videos that they've put out of their ground fighting. I mean, they're a serious force. So it was good at least that the U.S. didn't try to back that big offensive, because I think that would have been a total failure.
Yeah, historically, Yemen is like an Afghanistan light type polity, where it's a place where if you're an external actor, you're most certain going to enter a military quagmire should you put boots on the ground or whatever.
Yeah, you're right. It is very similar if you look at the history to Afghanistan in that way. Specifically, the area of Yemen, like the North Yemen. Even though if you look at a map, it's really like west, but like specifically,
yeah.
They've been empires have not been able to conquer them.
Yeah, for sure. Now, let's shift gears, because obviously the conflict in Yemen now is very linked to what's happening in Israel, especially in Gaza above all. And I mentioned UAE because, and I think this has relevance here, Socotra has also a connection with Somaliland, the place that the Trump administration has been rumored to recognize like its independence. And I think this is part of a quid pro quo where they will recognize their independence, but Somaliland will offer itself up as a place to resettle Palestinians. And do you think that there is going to be a mass expulsion of Palestinians in the next few months, as it appears that the Netanyahu government is going through with a very much like an exterminationist or like at least an mass expulsion plan in Gaza at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what they want. It's very clear that that's what their goal is, and Netanyahu's not shy about it. The question is who's going to take them? Because a lot of these African countries are Muslim countries, and they don't want to be seen as like facilitating this. But the U.S. does have a lot of ways that it could bribe these countries, and Somaliland, I think, is a perfect example. As you said, like they want the recognition from the U.S. I mean, they've been essentially an independent country for like 30 years. And, I don't know, maybe you've seen more than me, like what their leadership has said publicly, because we've seen all these reports, like these different countries, and the ones that you see named, I mean, like Sudan, South Sudan, Libya,
Indonesia,
these are not places you want to go. But there's been, reports, they're in talks with this country, and then they always come out and deny it. And Indonesia is one that's been floated as well. They've also denied it. But it does seem like these talks are happening. Like, I think there's been enough reporting and signs. Like, South Sudan denied it. There's a report in AP, and they cited people on the record. Like one of the guys was an American lobbyist who South Sudan hired to improve their relations with the U.S., who said that these talks were happening. And then, so South Sudan denied it, but then like a couple hours later, they put out another press release that they were hosting the most senior Israeli official that's like ever visited the country. So definitely there's something going on there. And South Sudan is not a Muslim country. They're majority Christian, but considering their history with fighting the Muslims in the north, and it's also an ethnic thing. Like I don't know if they're going to be take too kindly to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Muslims coming into their country. But and then Libya is the other one. So now there's new reports about the so-called internationally recognized government is apparently in talks because there's like tens of billions of dollars in frozen funds that the U.S. controls, and these things are in discussion. So essentially, like if this happens, it will be the U.S. bribing these countries to take these Palestinians in, and you see among Palestinians in Gaza, whenever they're interviewed about this, they say that they don't want to leave. This is their home. But at the same time, if they open the gates and they're allowed out, a lot of people are going to leave just because of the humanitarian situation. And they know once they leave, they're not going back. But yeah, I think a lot of it depends on what happens in the next in the next days and weeks when it comes to this big offensive that they're planning for Gaza City. Because if you read the plans, according to Israeli media, the plan is to forcibly displace the 1 million Palestinian civilians in Gaza City to the south. And then once they take over the city, they're going to destroy it. They're going to completely destroy it, demolish it. They plan to spend over a year doing that. So like the idea that they're going to let the Palestinians return and rebuild. But the idea, can they actually move that many people? I don't know. They're going to have a hard time. So I think a lot depends on what happens in there's some like murmurs about a potential ceasefire deal, but it's hard to believe that's going to happen at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard like the rumors too, but the obvious destination also being like Egypt, that they've been trying to like sweeten the deal for Egypt by erasing a lot of its like IMF debt. They've been trying to pull that type of lever, but it's a hot potato issue because especially when you move a bunch of Palestinians to countries so close to Israel like Egypt or Jordan, you could have a situation where you might get reprisals. You could get like a delayed response from not just like a terrorist unit, but it could be could see like those governments topple and they have like an Islamist government take its place. Like it's the case of Egypt, for example. It's very likely. And that's like a really big thing because you could basically erase like multiple decades of peace that Israel tried to like establish with Egypt by just doing that. And then have you heard the rumors about even Syria of all places being a potential destination for these people being expelled?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. I don't know if there's that much to that, but they just had some direct talks with Syria. So I guess, that might be a possibility that I could see the US trying to go for that because they're trying to get, certain things out of this new Syrian, this Al-Qaeda government. But it was a good point you made about Egypt and Jordan too. Like if they, allow Israel to do this and all these hundreds of thousands or millions of Palestinians going to Egypt or Jordan, I think they could face revolutions in those countries. And I know in Jordan, they're like cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood right now. And the king, Abdullah, half his population is Palestinian.
Yeah. So, that's the thing, like why I think like when people say that, like, oh, why aren't these Muslim countries taking it? It's like, well, for a start, in Jordan, you already have like a massive Palestinian population and a government that is also just seen as a stooge. And like Egypt is even weirder because it has a unstable economic situation to boot, and especially since the Ukraine war, because of all the grain disruptions and the shipments of grain, like just adding that Palestinian element there as enough to like blow that whole system over, and you get like a big regional conflagration. It actually makes more sense to go to like far off places like Libya or Indonesia, but I mean that's like a logistical nightmare doing that. You might also get a delayed reaction as well, because like this is like a terrorist blowback moment waiting to happen when you do a mass expulsion like that. That's being live streamed and like covered around the clock.
Yeah, that is the thing. Like you said, like a logistics nightmare. Like, how are they going to do this? Are they going to fill cargo planes with people and fly to Libya? Like,
I mean, that is such an awful like photo op. Like that's I mean, the thing is too, just looking at the whole Gaza conflict, it is like it has given like the first time citizen journalists, people all over social media, alternative media, are able to live stream essentially in like an industrial scale, like ritual murder of like innocent people. It's unprecedented in like the history of like the coverage of any type of conflict. And yeah, it's looking pretty bad. I want to shift our gaze though to the West Bank, because I feel that the West Bank has largely been overlooked, and it's been my working theory that Trump received that massive injection, financial injection by Miriam Adelson on the campaign trail, specifically to go after the West Bank. That's what the Israeli hard right is more obsessed with, because historically speaking, the West Bank is part of biblical Israel, the so-called Judea and Samaria, but Gaza, on the other hand, has historically not always been within that type of dominion. And that's the one thing a lot of these fanatics that have grown in prominence in Israel have a particular fixation with what's been going on in the West Bank lately.
Yeah, for them, the West Bank is the big prize. Like that's what they really want. There's been a lot going on in the West Bank. And it's one of those things, like if the violence and everything that was happening in the West Bank was going on, like independently, say there was nothing happening in Gaza, I mean, it would be wall-to-wall coverage of the West Bank. That's what we would see everywhere. There's a few different things happening. Like one thing that started earlier this year was Israel's military operation against the refugee camps in the northern West Bank. And they've gone in and essentially destroyed like hundreds of houses in these refugee camps in Jenin, in Tulkarm, in Ner Shams, and the numbers, they say they've displaced like 40,000 people from their homes there, and they're occupying them, and they have like a list of demands for what the Palestinian Authority must agree to before people can return. So I don't think they're going to let them go back. And then also the settler violence. I mean, it's really ramped up. And that seems like it's gotten more attention lately because it's just so blatant. It's like they set up these little outposts on like Palestinian farmland, and then they just like descend on people while they're, working in their olive groves or grazing their sheep, and attack them and beat them and sometimes kill them. We just ran a thing from the BBC. They had a whole film crew on this Palestinian farm when like you see these mass settlers like running down a hill and just like lighting things on fire and attacking people, and their goal is to make the people's life miserable so they leave so they can steal their land. Like it's terrorism. The purpose is to terrorize them, and they've been really emboldened by this Israeli government, this current government, since they came in at the end of 2022. They actually released a coalition statement saying that they were going to prioritize expanding settlements with the ultimate goal of annexing the West Bank, and they've been doing that, expanding settlements. And just today, this Israeli military committee gave final approval for this huge settlement expansion project called the E1 settlement that's been very controversial because it essentially splits the West Bank in two. And this, I think, is Smotrich's, the Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. He's also has a ministerial position in the defense ministry that basically makes him like the occupation governor of the West Bank. And he's a settler himself, and he's the most extreme of the extreme, and he is, has significant power right now. But he said, this is going to erase a Palestinian state. This is going to bury the Palestinian state, expanding these settlements. And this is their reaction to the France and the UK and Australia saying that they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. It's almost like emboldening them to grab more land, steal more land, and everything. Their problem in the West Bank is that there's a lot more Palestinians, and where are they going to go? So it's the demographics. I forget the exact numbers, but basically everyone, if all the Palestinians and Israelis living in, what they call Israel proper and the occupied Palestinian territories, it's about even, like the number of Jews and Palestinians. So say they gave them all voting rights, like, obviously Israel doesn't want that. So what are they going to do with all the Palestinians in the West Bank? I think, what they're doing now is kind of preferable to like annexation, because then there would be pressure for them. Okay, you annex the territory, it's officially Israeli. Then you got to give voting rights to the people who live there. So I think kind of this piece by piece where they can treat these people like this is kind of their preferable option. So I think it's going to be kind of more slow and drawn out than the destruction we've seen in Gaza.
Yeah, that's the thing too, about like in general with respect to the West Bank, because of the fact that it's just so much bigger. They will have to go more piece by piece. Hasn't the Trump administration though imposed sanctions on the Palestinian Authority though, or like done some maneuvers to like really fray relations with them?
Yeah. What did they do that over? Yeah, they just imposed sanctions on the Palestinian Authority because of their role in getting the ICC to go after the International Criminal Court, to go after Netanyahu and Gallant, the former defense minister, and I think the ICJ. So yeah, and I mean, you see the Palestinian Authority now, like Mahmoud Abbas, like, I don't think he can project a more like moderate. You just seem like more moderate than he is. Like, this is not Hamas. This is like the secular Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, collaboration is
Yeah. They are collaborators with the IDF, and Trump himself, I think he said he called Abbas like a grandfather or something. Like, he seemed to like him when he met him. And that's the thing. I mean, you see Netanyahu, he says, no Hamas, no Palestinian Authority can, govern the West Bank. So then what's the option? I mean, there's just some new Palestinian party. I mean, there's no real option right now. So yeah, the U.S. has done that. And they're also openly supporting the settlement expansion, because historically the U.S. was opposed to the settlements, at least acted like they were opposed, except for the first Trump administration was when they really started to give the settlements support, and they declared that they're not illegal under international law, even though they very clearly are. And now we have Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who's like a Christian Zionist, who claims that this land, God gave, historic Palestine to the modern state of Israel, and they have every right to it. Yeah, and that's how he's approaching this. And he was asked about this huge settlement plan, and he said, we're not going to oppose it. Israeli, he said something like, Israelis should be able to live in the land of Israel. And it's like, well, that's not their land. So, they are completely emboldened. So they're just going to keep going further and further in the West Bank. And yeah, like, I don't know what they ultimately want. Like, I mean, I'm almost surprised that there hasn't been like another intifada and like a big uprising.
Oh yeah,
bank with everything happening in Gaza. It seems like that's what they want, especially with the provocations at Al-Aqsa that Ben-Gvir has been doing lately. Because then they can really start, if there is like a uprising and attack, more attacks, and they can really start.
Yeah, you can justify that,
bombing them and killing them the way they are in Gaza.
Yeah. I remember one analyst, this was like a few months ago, was saying that by taking like the U.S. taking a more maximalist approach against the West Bank, they are kind of like laying the groundwork for discrediting the Palestinian Authority and letting like a Hamas-like group to fill in the void and to continue to sanction and not even try to play ball with the PA. It could create that type of like unintended consequence where they might get a more radical governing body there that might be much more confrontational to Israel.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, like if a new Palestinian party popped up, like would they want to cooperate with Israel or would they want to fight Israel? Like, are people more radicalized now than they were before October 7th? I'm sure they are. So yeah, I think that you said unintended consequence. I mean, that could be part of the strategy here.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
yeah, it could be. Yeah,
I think what Ben Gvir, is doing with, he goes to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and he, storms the place and brings all these settlers with him. Like, I think he's doing that for provocation. Like he wants to he really wants things to pop off in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and everything.
I want to go back to one of your points when you talked about like this countries like in the EU, UK, like the UK, France, and even countries like Australia and Canada talking about like a two-state solution. I get the suspicion that there is not only like theater involved with that, but also these countries are kind of building an alibi because something really horrific is a really like horrific escalation is on the horizon, and some of these countries want to distance themselves from it. And the best way to do that is to do like the typical kind of like liberal internationalist non-solution to this conflict by going like the two-state solution route. And what do you make of these like overtures towards recognizing a Palestinian state? Is there any much substance to it, or is it smoke and mirrors?
Yeah, I mean, it does seem a lot like smoke and mirrors, but at the same time, we are also seeing like things are changing when it comes to kind of the attitude in the US especially, and also in Europe. Like, I mean, the fact that Germany, MERS recently said that they're not going to sell weapons that could be used in Gaza. That's pretty significant because Germany, I mean, there's like laws against, you get arrested for, and same thing in the UK now with this crackdown on Palestine action. But at the same time, like you said, I do get the feeling it is like they're making an alibi. I saw MERS say, the German chancellor, that he thinks hundreds of thousands of civilians could be killed in this offensive on Gaza City. And so he might be trying to wash his hands of it. Because at the same time, the UK, France, and Germany really pushed for that war with Iran. I mean, they helped set the groundwork for that with their actions at the IAEA, censuring Iran. And when the war started, they like very strongly supported it. And this is Israel like, okay, so you're against what they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank, but you support them attacking Iran? Like, that doesn't really make sense. MERS said that Israel is doing our dirty work by attacking Iran. And then the two-state solution, I mean, what is recognizing a Palestinian state? What does that do for the Palestinians? It actually seems like it's having, based on what Smotrich is doing, it's having a detrimental effect on the Palestinians. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, what's the real motivation behind it? I don't know, but it does show, like, how out of step the U.S. is, like, with the whole world at this point, because we have seen, like, I mean, again, not that this is much. We've seen, like, strongly worded letters from all the U.S. allied countries in the world, basically, calling for an end to the blockade and a ceasefire and everything. So the U.S. is certainly out on its own with this unconditional support for Israel. But what does it really mean? I don't know.
Yeah. Speaking of changing opinions and like the breakdown of like the prevailing consensus on like Israel, one of like the most unusual shifts we're seeing is like people like the Republican Congresswoman of Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who actually used to be a pretty generic pro-Zionist conservative, recently become very critical of Israel, especially with regards to the arrests of that guy, Artyom Alexandrovich, the Israeli like national cyber directive executive. What do you make of Greene's like criticism of that guy and just her general break from like the GOP's pro-Israel orthodoxy?
Yeah, I think she's really just tapping into, what we're seeing more on the right in the US, especially among younger people, that they are just sick of this, unconditional support for Israel. Because I think there was a lot of people in the Republican Party on the right in general who were just pro-Israel, like by default. They were like, oh, the left is against Israel. The politicians I support like Israel. I know Israelis like, yeah, we should support Israel and support its right to defend itself. But now, after nearly 2 years of a live stream genocide in Gaza and kind of some of the blatant stuff, interference that we've seen from Israel, like the people are starting to notice the boycott laws, which have been going on for years at the state level. But what was the story recently that the DHS said that they would withhold disaster relief from countries or states that boycott Israeli companies? I mean, that stuff wakes people up, so the people that might have been pro-Israel by default are turning against it. And the polling does show like the boomer Republicans are all still, very pro-Israel, but younger people like under 40 are very much.
Oh, yeah.
So I think Greene is tapping into that. I think she sees which way the wind is blowing. I mean, I think she's like populist in her nature. And we are and I think it's good because she's giving that room. She's seeding the ground for like right politicians on the right to come out against this. Thomas Massie obviously has been good for a while, but that's kind of his just consistent principled stance against foreign aid and everything. And he's always been an outlier, but seeing Greene, because she's kind of a specific like flavor of the MAGA right. And we're also seeing, and I'm hearing like in different elections around the country, we're starting to see people, Republicans running on like anti-APAC campaigns and stuff. So this seems like a significant thing that's happening. So in the long term, like I think Israel is really in trouble when it comes to the support from the U.S. But nothing is going to change at the federal level for a long time still. But there's definitely something happening here.
Yeah, it's mostly like the narrative and like online discourse where there's a paradigm shift brewing, but at the political level, there's still considerable amounts of inertia. And to be honest, it harkens to the speech that Douglas McGregor gave at the Ron Paul Institute conference that we attended, where he's basically saying that we have effectively a gerontocracy, a golf cart regime of people that live from a different generational cohort that continue to be pro-Zionist, whereas like the younger generations are just not with that program.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Joe Biden. It's like it was so very clearly going to really hurt him, and then Harris in the election. Like he could have made Netanyahu sign that ceasefire deal the day before. What was it, like the day before Trump's inauguration that they signed it? Biden could have got them to sign that months before that, and it was like the same deal from like 8 months ago. But there was recently Israeli TV had this like report. They interviewed all these former Biden officials, and they were like, yeah, he wasn't going to do anything to go against Israel, even though he did some symbolic stuff. And when he did that stuff, Netanyahu like publicly went after him, and he still wouldn't pull the plug. And Harris was just doing whatever she was told, basically. So like she wasn't going to, put the pressure on Netanyahu either. But yeah, I mean, you just saw it. Like it was a big factor, I think, in the elections. You saw the events getting disrupted. I mean, Genocide Joe like flowed so nicely off the tongue that that there was all these disruptions and stuff at campaign events, and I think it was really embarrassing for him and for Harris, but they just didn't affect the policy. They still just gave Netanyahu what he wanted, even though he humiliated them at the same time. And you see it in what Biden says, like that golf cart geriatric, like this type of old American politician. I mean, how long was he in the Senate? He's just like, I'm a Zionist. He's always talking about how he's a Zionist, how if there wasn't an Israel, we would have to make an Israel. Just he wasn't going to change, waver from that point of view, no matter what they did.
Yeah. I was very fascinated by your appearance on Breaking Points, where you were discussing just broadly speaking, stuff about Israel and Iran, especially the so-called 12-day war between the two countries. And one point that really stuck out to me in your analysis of those events was Iran's stronger than expected performance against Israel. Can you expand on what happened there and what actually led to that ceasefire and cessation in military operations there?
Yeah, so Trita Parsi had a good piece at Foreign Policy, which we discussed in that Breaking Points appearance. He laid things out very nicely in that short article that he wrote. But essentially there was, three goals of Israel, three things that they wanted to accomplish. He listed the nuclear facilities, destroying the nuclear facilities, which I don't really think, that was not their primary goal, which I think he said in the article, but that's not what this was about. The other two goals that they wanted to achieve, one was, it was either regime change, and it was clear that the initial, decapitation strikes were an attempt at regime change. There's a report from the Washington Post that Mossad agents were calling up Iranian generals, telling them to make videos saying that you're defecting, or we're going to kill your family, we're going to kill your wife and children. And they targeted all the senior Iranian leadership. So that obviously didn't happen. But the other goal was they wanted to turn Iran into another Syria or Lebanon, into a country that they could bomb with impunity. I mean, Lebanon's got no air defenses. Israeli jets can fly across the whole country. Now, same thing with Syria, basically. But they didn't achieve that because Iran was able to, in the initial day, it did seem like Israel was really hurting them. And a big part of it, I think, was everything that happened on the ground, because Israel has always had significant intel assets in Israel. And there were drone attacks coming from inside Iran and really took out the air defenses. But Iran was able to kind of recover from that. And then they started firing the missiles at Israel. And we all saw, they had a significant number of missiles were getting past the air defenses. And, these are attacks at Israel. We've never seen Israel come under any attacks similar to this before. And so they were able to really get some shots off. And then it was 12 days and there was the ceasefire. And Israel killed a lot more people. They killed 1,000 people in Iran versus a few dozen who were killed in Israel. And one reason is they have bomb shelters everywhere in Israel, except for in some of the Arab areas where people were just left out to dry and got killed. We saw it at the end, right up to the end. Iran was getting big shots off on Israel, and there was reporting throughout the war that they started using their more advanced missiles about halfway through, and then it was the percentage being intercepted was much lower. So Iran's response was very calculated, and we also saw that in their response to the U.S. bombing their nuclear facilities. They gave the U.S. notice, which I was not expecting that. I was worried that this would mean, Iran's going to unleash its missiles and there could be American casualties, but that didn't happen. They gave the U.S. notice, and the U.S. evacuated the base. So the concern here is that it's clear Israel wants another round. They want another war, and they want the U.S. to get more involved beyond just bombing the nuclear facilities. So if there is another war, it's going to be, Iran's going to hit back much harder. It's not going to be as calculated. They might just start firing all they got at U.S. bases at Israel and everything. If Trump doesn't change what he's doing, this kind of unconditional support for Israel, plus making these unrealistic demands of Iran, that they must get rid of their, not enrich uranium and everything, then it just seems like we're inevitably going to end up in another war here. And the regime, the government in Iran, another thing. So it was interesting at the Ron Paul Institute event, Max Blumenthal and Anya Parampil talked about their trip to Iran.
It was a great talk. Yes.
Yeah. And one thing that they said, and that I've heard this from all sorts of sources, is that in Iran there was the rally around the flag moment. That because you look at what the government, their rhetoric, kind of their whole identity is, they're under siege from the U.S. and Israel as their enemies, and then this war happens and they get targeted, and senior IRGC officials, generals get killed. The president of Iran was actually injured. A senior advisor to Khamenei was buried under the rubble. Initial reports said that he was dead. So it's like the government took hits. And I think, and they also bombed residential buildings. So like the people were very much under Israeli attack, and they rallied around the government. And even like the U.S. funded NGOs, like the opposition people here in the U.S., were very against it. I mean, even like the except for like the Shah's son.
Yeah. That like AstroTurf type. Yeah.
Yeah. They, like even again, the U.S. funded like groups were against the war. So, the government is maybe even in a stronger position now. Obviously, they took hits to their air defenses. And that's the thing. Israel's not they don't want to wait around while they rebuild it. And another aspect is they might have spent there's been a huge crackdown in Iran, on alleged Mossad spy rings, and we've seen a lot of arrests. So Israel might have spent a lot of their intel the majority of their intel assets in the country. So yeah, it's just not, it was not a victory for Israel or the U.S. by any means.
Yep. What is going on in Lebanon? Because there's obviously the Iran connection with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah initially took a pretty devastating blow with those decapitation strikes of Nasrallah and other leaders. But it seems that Hezbollah has not been put away, and that the country might be on the verge of some type of civil unrest or even a civil war because of like this new disarmament plan that's the U.S. and Israel want the Lebanese government to execute, that would effectively see Hezbollah give up its arms. What's going on there?
Yeah. So since November 2024, there's been a so-called ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah, but Israel has been bombing Lebanon, almost every day, basically, since then. They're just completely flagrantly violating it. And Hezbollah hasn't fired back one time. So it does go to show that they took a serious beating during that war, which involved that pager attack and really heavy airstrikes. They destroyed a lot of southern Lebanon, and Israel is still occupying parts of southern Lebanon that they agreed to withdraw from under the deal. So yeah, with all this happening, the U.S. is demanding and the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government has said that they're going to do it, but within like 90 days or something. But Hezbollah, do they have the ability to do that? It's always been believed that Hezbollah is a much more powerful military force than the Lebanese National Army. Yeah, Hezbollah took a beating, but they still got a lot of members. And if you saw Nasrallah's funeral, still a lot of support. And so, if there's like a battle, like ground battles between if this does turn into a civil war, it's going to rip the country apart. So it's concerning because, so that's what's happening is they're saying they're going to disarm Hezbollah. Hezbollah is saying they're not going to disarm. And then if you try to do it, it could mean civil war. The new Hezbollah chief has actually said that. And, when it comes to Israel, at least, that's probably, they probably would be happy if there was a civil war in Lebanon that would give them the opportunity to take more territory. When it comes to the U.S., who knows exactly what the U.S. wants. If they just want to enable Israel to take more land, then I guess if it goes in that direction, they'll be happy. But I just find it hard to believe that the U.S. and this envoy, this guy, Tom Barrack, have you seen him, how he operates at all? He's
vaguely.
He's the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, but he's also been acting as a special envoy to Syria, and he's also been involved in this Lebanon stuff. And he's just all over the map. Because Lebanon's response to the demand to disarm Hezbollah initially was, how about Israel fulfills the ceasefire deal first, and then we talk about that? And Barrack said no. He said, no, we can't make them stop bombing you. Sorry. And around the same time, he's telling Israel to stop bombing the Al Qaeda guys in Syria. So he's just all over the place. And now he's saying, okay, now that you decided to disarm Hezbollah, we'll talk to Israel about fulfilling the ceasefire. But we still see like basically daily drone strikes and little ground incursions. So I don't know. I mean, it's not going in a good direction in Lebanon, because I can't imagine a situation where Hezbollah, lays down its weapons and everybody starts getting along, and that's that. And that was another thing. I'm sure Hezbollah still has missile capabilities to some extent. We don't really know what, but in the 12-day war, they didn't get involved. So that's another thing. Can they, like, if there is another war with Iran, can Hezbollah get into the mix? Can they do damage to Israel? That's another possibility too. So there's just a lot of uncertainty about what direction it's going to go.
Indeed. Yeah, and just cap this off, just talking about Russia, do you think that summit that was recently held in Alaska is going to lead to any diplomatic breakthroughs, or are we just going to see more of the same as far as the Russia-Ukraine conflict goes, which seems to not to be anywhere close to a conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to be hopeful that it's going to lead to some kind of deal, but right now, like you see, after that summit, the coalition of the willing, they're calling themselves, which is this group led by the UK and France that are saying that they're going to send troops to Ukraine. Like, their whole idea is there's going to be a peace deal, and then we're going to send troops to Ukraine to enforce it. And it's just like, what are you talking? Like, it's just so out there. And Russia has just been saying, absolutely not. We're never going to agree to anything like that. And Trump seems to be coming around to their idea, suggesting that the U.S. could support them with air power. So, yeah, it's not looking good. And the territory issue, it seemed like Russia backed down on some of its demands. Essentially, they want Ukraine to withdraw from the Donbass. But the southern oblasts that they have annexed, they said that they're willing to freeze the lines there, which basically means Ukraine wouldn't have to withdraw from the territory down there. But Zelensky hasn't shown any room on that. But again, maybe there's other stuff happening behind the scenes. But when you see the Europeans and, taking these maximalist positions and backing Zelensky the way they are, and it seems like Trump's kind of going along with it, even though he had that whole summit, it's just tough to believe that this is going to lead to some kind of deal.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. I think this actually aligns with like a theory. Brian Berletic of New Atlas has put forward like the continuity of agenda, where the Trump administration will signal that they want to end this conflict, but in reality, they're going to use like a sleight of hand where they will continue to arm Europe and effectively outsource a lot of like the geopolitical skullduggery to Europe, while Trump and like the U.S. Focus most of its resources to contain China.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, I think that's where this is going, and we're already seeing like that NATO has this new thing where like the NATO countries in Europe are buying U.S. weapons to ship to Ukraine. And we see it in the rhetoric from J.D. Vance. He said right before the summit, like, oh, the U.S. is done funding the war in Ukraine. But if the Europeans want to step up and buy our weapons, then sure, we'll support that.
Yep.
And it is clear. I mean, and that is like the direction that the Trump administration wants to go, is to focus more on China. So yeah, I think that's probably right. That's unfortunately how this is probably going to end up, but it's scary because the rhetoric you see from these European leaders, like,
unhinged.
It's crazy. Like, they're saying they got to be ready for war with Russia, and like in a few years, like Russia's going to invade Europe. I mean, when they're still fighting in the Donbass after over 3 years, like, it's just absurd. Like, and again, it is scary. It like does scare me, because it's like, if this is how they're thinking and how they approach this situation, like, where are they going to lead the world? What are we going to go into? And same thing with the U.S. I mean, this idea that we're going to fight a war with China in the future is really crazy. So yeah, it's not looking great. And, a lot of it at the same time, the whole situation in the Middle East is just completely blown up. So the China hawks, the real China hawks in the Trump administration who want to less focus on Ukraine and the Middle East are probably not happy about how things have gone so far. But I think they're probably trying to disengage, at least from Ukraine, to put more resources toward China.
Yep, that's what it looks like in the grand scheme of things, because that is what is the U.S. grand strategy of confronting China in Cold War 2.0. Anyways, I think this is a good spot to put a bookmark in this conversation, but I'd like to thank you, Dave, for taking the time out of your evening to discuss these matters. But as always, before you sign off, where can listeners follow your reporting and tune into your podcast?
Yeah, so all my writing is at antiwar.com. My show called Antiwar News, it's on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, if you prefer to watch. Most people listen to the podcast. It's like a short 20 to 30-minute rundown of the news stories that I cover that I put out 5 days a week. So you could listen to the podcast wherever you download podcasts. And then you can follow me on X, we're calling it now, at DeCamp Dave is my handle there.
Fantastic. Well, that's all for Headline Geopolitics tonight. And thank you all for tuning in to the show. And before you leave, be sure to subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more conversations on geopolitics. Until next time, I'm José Niño.